Thank you everybody for coming to this wonderful event, the most fascinating event that you'll go to today, because it's about food and about coffee, about things that we really care about. We know how important agriculture is in terms of driving emissions, in terms of deforestation and the emissions created both through nitrous oxide but also the fossil fuels used to produce agriculture. And obviously agriculture is massively affected by climate change. So creating sustainable, resilient agriculture is a really, really important issue. Agricultural production, we actually only eat a very small range of crops and they are threatened by pests. So looking at alternative form crops, but also strengthening the crops we've got is obviously really crucial. That's essentially what we're going to be looking at. We're going to talk about fascinating things like the false banana we'll bring up, and we'll be talking about crop wild relatives and how they can help agriculture become more sustainable and hopefully more productive as well. And crucially, we'll also be talking about the ways in which soil can capture carbon and can, again, be part of our ways of addressing climate change. And to introduce this, we are honoured to be joined by Mary, how do I pronounce your surname? Cray, like the twins, yeah, exactly. By Mary Cray, who's our, I've got to check all of this, who is our Minister for Nature at the Department of the Environment. That was a very poor introduction, wasn't it? Mary, take the stage.
Thanks, Justin. Don't worry, I always like to say it's like the twins, only harder. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this second week of COP29 and Agriculture Day here in the UK's Pavilion. I'm delighted to be here with you in Baku, and the focus areas this week are going to be agriculture, water, education, transport. I believe there are some colleagues that are cycling here from London. It's only taken them 5 months. When I asked Chris Boardman, did he have some snacks for them, he promised me that he had a few packets of quavers. So living the dream. But we're also going to be looking at nature, oceans, gender, and Indigenous peoples and local communities. So kicking off the ag events for today, I want to give, first of all, a huge thanks to our partners at Kew for organising this expert discussion with global thought leaders on the critical role of crop diversification and wild species in building resilience to climate change and enhancing biodiversity, and also, once again, for providing excellent union hand-roasted coffee in the pavilion. Which you can hear the machine bubbling away in the background. I'm particularly thrilled that I've had my coffee this morning, as during the conference on biodiversity there was a brief micro nap moment where the jet lag crept in. So the conservation and sustainable use of plant genetic resources is a vital component in the creation of stable and resilient food systems. Up to 3/4 of global agricultural biodiversity has been lost since the 20th century. Our plant genetic resources include not only agricultural crops, but also crop wild relatives. These are the wild ancestors and close relatives of our commercially grown crops. So they include things like wild Emma wheat, which is related to cultivated wheats, or creeping marshwort, a relative of celery. These wild cousins grow freely in our landscapes, where they continue to adapt to their local environments. And unlike their domesticated cousins, they are a rich source of genetic diversity, and breeders and growers can use those genetic traits to develop newer, stronger, higher yielding crop varieties resistant to pests and diseases and more tolerant to heat and drought. An early example of such breeding from the 1900s is the crossing of domesticated potatoes with a wild Mexican potato species, Solanum demissum, to produce varieties resistant to potato blight, which was a crop disease which caused devastating famine in Ireland in the mid-19th century. More recently, a group of scientists, including from Kew, discovered that Stenophylla, coffee, a rare wild species from Upper West Africa, has a higher tolerance to warm temperatures than other commercially grown coffees. And as such, it has the potential to be used as a breeding resource to produce new climate-resilient coffee crops for global consumption. So the UK is playing its part in conserving crop wild relatives for future generations by storing genetic materials such as seeds in gene banks, including in the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which I visited back in 2018, making this genetic material available for use in research and in breeding. Indeed, DEFRA's flagship genetic improvement networks draw on these gene banks and work with researchers, growers and breeders to identify traits that make key UK crops stronger, more resilient and more sustainable. And they also help unlock innovation opportunities, including through the application of precision breeding. At the Global Food Security Summit in November 23, the UK announced an additional £45 million of UK funding for CGIAR. So this new commitment brings our support to a total of £110 million over the next 3 years. The new funding includes support for the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils in Africa, in which the UK is proud to partner with USAID. It also includes £5 million UK support for the Global Crop Diversity Trust, protecting the priceless biodiversity stored in global seed banks. We were talking just now about the Rothamsted Soil Archive, which goes back 180 years. When asked why, when I went to Rothamsted and said, why do you do this? The scientist who was leading me around just said, well, we've just got a tendency to collect things in the UK. So that's what we do. The importance of these seed banks and soil banks cannot be overstated. They are the foundation of global crop breeding programs, underpinning our ability to develop adapted, climate-resilient, nutritious crops into the future. And in Colombia, at the previous COP in Cali, at the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity, I visited the International Centre for Tropical Agriculture, CIAT. They have an incredible future seeds gene bank, which they store everything at minus 20 degrees. And their real aim is to safeguard part of the world's genetic agricultural diversity and protect humanity's future food supply. There, they told me how after the genocide in Rwanda, thousands of farmers had either been killed or forced to flee their farms, and that traditional crops and food supply was endangered. At CIAT, they achieved the repatriation of no less than 260 varieties of beans from Palmyra to Rwanda after only 1 year. So when we have man-made devastation, these seed banks are incredibly powerful tools and resources to help nations and communities rebuild after disasters. So this underscores the very real importance of seed banks and gene banks in maintaining crop diversity, for helping farmers adapt to climate change and ensure food security in a changing and challenging world. So this is not a dry technical issue. It's about farmers being able to feed their families so children don't go to school hungry. About being able to make a little bit of surplus so they can afford to improve their lives and those of their communities. We are on a mission as the new government to create a world where free of poverty on a livable planet. And essentially conserving these important genetic resources is key in achieving that vision for a better future for everyone on this planet. Thank you.
Mary Cray, thank you very much indeed. Now let me introduce, we've got an illustrious panel for you, so let me introduce them and then let's get down to this fascinating conversation. Dr. Zituni Ould Dada is a senior advisor at the FAIR Initiative for Sustainable Investment in Agri-Food Systems. You're a veteran, I think, of 14 of these COP conferences. 15, oh, this is your 15th. My heart goes out to you. They're a terrible, terrible ordeal. Sieg Snap, you're the Program Director of Sustainable Agri-Food Systems at CIMMYT, and you are an expert on soil carbon, aren't you? And we'll be certainly talking about soil carbon later on. Third in the panel is Casper Chater, Senior Research Leader on Crops and Global Change at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. And at the end there, we have Dr. Adifires Werku, who is the chair of the Green Legacy Initiative Technical Committee and an expert on Ethiopian agriculture. But to kick things off, I think if it's all right, let's talk about the coffee that you can hear, as Mary said, being made next door. There's a huge queue around. What is so special about the coffee? What does it tell us about the potential role of wild varieties in agriculture?
So can you hear me okay? Good. Thank you very much. So this is Ethiopian Yayu coffee. It's a wild Arabica, and our Ethiopian partners are collaborating with the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew to really maintain and sustain a agri-forestry approach with this wild coffee germplasm for livelihoods and value chain improvement, and really to put back into that agroforestry system a way of life that ensures that the crop itself, the wild coffee, is maintained and improved, and we hope you enjoy it.
Well, I was keen to understand, because what's special about it? How did you find? There's a great adventure behind this coffee, isn't there? I think you rather undersold it there. Tell us about how you went and found the wild variety that wasn't being produced commercially and has these properties that could be really useful.
So Dr. Aaron Davis, who is at Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, has incredible relationships with people in Ethiopia going back many, many years, and there is wild diversity in Ethiopian forests that they can really capture and make the most of.
So how many varieties of coffee do we consume at the moment?
At the moment,
as agricultural crops?
We are completely reliant on really just 2 species of coffee for global coffee production. And this is really quite dangerous if we want our
And how many species of coffee are there in the wild?
Oh my goodness, there are...
Sorry about that, he's not a coffee expert, it's really unfair of me.
But there are at least 2 wild coffee species, Stenophila, that Minister Cray mentioned earlier, and Liberica, both of which have really climate-resilient properties for heat stress and drought stress.
So you need a coffee, one of the issues is that wild coffee has to taste good as well. So you've got to find a coffee that tastes good but has useful properties. And your people, Kew Gardens researchers, went with Ethiopian researchers into the forest to try and find these new varieties.
Exactly.
And I think didn't people know that there was a variety out there that they thought had these properties, but there was thought to have been lost?
Yes, so many of these things have been continued through indigenous peoples who are, the custodians, the guardians of these amazing wild and domesticated species, and my boss essentially has the wonderful job of tasting this stuff and finding out what will really work in global markets.
And so the idea is that this, essentially a wild variety, could now, as climate change affects the production of the 2 other commercial varieties of coffee, this could be a kind of replacement. So, there was a real threat to coffee, wasn't there? And the hope is that we will be able to, even in a hotter world, drink coffee.
Exactly, and we are being guided by the farmers. The farmers are growing what works, and they're not growing what doesn't work, because essentially they can't sell it, because it won't grow. So if farmers are able to grow these species, and they want to, and they know it's a good quality product, then we're following their guidance.
And actually, across agriculture, it's quite surprising how few varieties we consume. So the main crop varieties, Zutuni, what are the main crop varieties? What are the threats to those varieties?
Well, the threat obviously is from climate change, since we're talking about the topic. The intensity and severity of extreme weather events is increasing, and that's affecting the yields of crops. So almost half.
We don't actually eat. I mean, the staple crops. How many staple crops are there?
Almost half of the world's supply of food relies on 3 crops: wheat, maize, and rice. So obviously there is so much choice there, and yet we're focusing on a narrow number of crops. Really, we need to diversify.
And increasingly, because commercial agriculture produces just certain strains, there's much less genetic variety in the crops that we produce.
Well, there is a lot of innovation going on, as we were saying earlier. Actually, trying
to get to the innovation. Let's set the problem up first. But there are, we are producing fewer varieties of those crops worldwide. Is that right?
We are, but in terms of consumption, as I said, we're not consuming a diversity of crops. That's the problem. Our there are around 500,000 plants around the world. Our ancestors were consuming around 30,000. We have only 125 in the market. So that tells you something about, how much we're narrowing our choice. So we really need to diversify, and we need to take into account the fact that there are so many of the crops actually are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. By 2050, we expect the yield of crops, because of the impacts of climate change, to decrease by about 30%. And when we have so many challenges, there is so much at stake, especially with the growing population that we need to feed and nourish. So by 2050, we need to double food production. So you can imagine the impact of natural resources in general, not just on food, on water, on land, on biodiversity. So we need to adapt. We have no choice but to adapt to the impact of climate change and to wake up to the new reality.
So, Adifiras, how much of Ethiopia is actually at the forefront of bringing in new varieties. Ethiopia, in fact, is one of the countries where you eat a more diverse range of basic crops than the rest of the world.
Thank you very much for having me. Yes, first of all, I wanted to reiterate one point, that we have 2 coffee varieties now. And we say that we might have a little bit more in the wild, but we need to keep our hope on what is already domesticated and maintain them than, looking at and putting all our hope on the one in the wild. I mean, this is what I wanted to say, that we need to stop climate change affecting us. I mean, we cannot continue, adapting to it. So we need to also talk about climate change adaptation, but the need to talk about climate change mitigation is going to be very important. For instance, in Ethiopia, we don't have another wild coffee. What we have is coffee robusta. We diversified it to different varieties. You come, Dirga Chafe variety, Yayu variety, a lot of them. But indeed, climate change is affecting this crop. But the most important thing that the global community needs to think of stopping changing climate, so that what we domesticated now will stay with us. That is going to be the most important thing. When I come to Ethiopia's biodiversity context, indeed, Ethiopia is one of the 7 Pavilion of agro-biodiversity centers, where we have really many species. Our farmers still rely on, diverse species of even wheat, even barley, even other vegetables, so on and so forth. We are also trying to keep, those in the wild, so that, the cross breeding will continue between the wild and also the already domesticated one. Yeah, but I said that climate change is pushing us, to break that one, so that some of the landrace, the most important crops that disease-resistant, drought-resistant, are now going out of our hand, because, the food commodity, the food companies are also pushing farmers to drop out the landrace and go for those most, productive one, which I see is going to be a challenge in the future.
But it's in the interests of food companies. Anyone on the panel take this up. It's in the interests of food companies to make sure that we do have resilient crops that are productive as well. So, presumably they want to be part of this process, no?
Absolutely. I think there is a recognition from companies, from investors, that there are so many risks to agri-food systems, to food production, and you cannot actually achieve food security unless you address those risks. And that means that we need to have policies in place that can actually enable investors to come in with confidence and invest in technologies, invest in innovation, invest in new varieties of crops. Because we know where we're heading, we have clear targets, as you were saying, we need to have mitigation, take it seriously. If we talk about adaptation, adaptation can only work if we actually do a lot on mitigation. The two go together. We need to have deep reductions of greenhouse gas emissions and then adapt, because we have no choice. We left it so late now that we have no choice but to adapt to the impact of climate change. And I'll add just one final point, that even though we've been neglecting adaptation, unfortunately, even for investment, we invest very little on adaptation. Now we need to go even beyond adaptation. We need to talk more about resilience of agriculture, resilience of our lifestyle as well. And I think we need to learn from previous experience as well, even the pandemic, which is not far behind us. I'm not sure how much we learned from that in actually making our lifestyle more resilient, and also the food production that was much affected by the distribution of food that was affected by the pandemic, unfortunately. So we really need to make deep reductions. We need to combine that with building adaptation and build resilience going forward.
Let's talk a bit about adaptation, and let's talk about another aspect of adapting, seed snap. Let's talk a bit about how we can adapt to make our soils build the carbon in our soils. And we were discussing it earlier. This is a really central issue, isn't it, in terms of tackling climate change, is returning the carbon that was stored in our soils, bringing it back in. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, very well said. In fact, resilience, as you say, sir, is actually, it's about people and soils and plants. These all go together. We are discovering, and Ethiopia is leading the way in this, and the Minister of Agriculture there is investing, guiding by data that's been collected on where do we need the most crop diversity, where do we need straight ahead diversity of, say, wheat, but a lot of wheat, right? Because you need calories too. But when you add a little bit of diversity and really support people in making better decisions and sustainable sourcing, so public sector, private sector, and civil society working together, you can improve soil carbon sequestration. It's not just about how we till the soil, it's about that crop diversity to rebuild soil carbon.
Yeah, this is really interesting, because I realized I really didn't understand how soils store carbon. And I assumed that it was the bodies of the plants that stored the carbon in the soil. Sieg put me right. So explain, what is the process by which, plant matter becomes carbon in the soil?
He's giving a soil professor time to explain to you about soil organic carbon.
It's really interesting.
So watch out, put on your seatbelts. No, really simply, microbes eat and change plant material into the soil carbon that then stores water.
So it's not the woody matter.
It's not the woody matter. It is the turnover. And so that's why grasses are important, including big grasses like maize and wheat and teff, all these kind of crops. And if they don't have the diversity, people think microbes live by themselves. They think, we add a inoculum to the soil and it lives. No, where do they live? They live in plant roots. So again, and then who plants those? So it's people, plants, and the soil together, because we have shown, and actually Rothamsted in UK has shown this as well, that if you have right management with crop diversity of soils, you store so much water. So in a drought, it's not just about drought-resistant varieties, it's about crops that improve the soil carbon that then stores the water.
But crucially, you were saying that you would imagine that the more plant matter you manage to grow on your land, the more carbon you'd store, because there's more matter there to be stored in the soil. But that's not how it works, is it? And actually, because the microbes live in the roots, that's why biodiversity is so important.
Exactly, and that's something we're really starting to see a sea change in the discussions here at COP. It is trees, of course, but it's also about what's in the roots to build soil carbon. It's not just, you see trees, you see those big trunks, right? But in fact, it's a lot about the roots, and the diverse roots are what empower the microbes to store carbon. So it's actually diversity that builds the soil organic matter, not just trees.
And how much difference does it make? Because it is a huge difference, isn't it?
It is, because about 3% of the carbon, everyone says, oh, well, when you plow, you lose all the carbon. Yes, but it's critical, the amount that is stored. It's only 3% normally, but it gets to be like 4% if you have diversity. So we've really only recently discovered this, and it really makes a huge difference. Why sustainable sourcing and other types of approaches, ministers of agriculture making investments in soil health are realizing, oh, we need crop diversity for not only diverse diets for people, nutrition, but nutrition for the soil as well.
Adifiras, that is something, again, that's being pioneered in Ethiopia, isn't it? That you're, growing, trying to have, wild crops with agriculture.
Yeah, in Ethiopia, this traditional ecological knowledge system, farmers' knowledge, and also their institution and their practice are really very much in favor of living with nature. It is since recently that, we who went to school came back to the village and started to disturb, what was there. Otherwise, our farmers gave priority to the link between nature and also their practice. That is how, Ethiopia maintained, even despite those vulnerabilities, those poverties, whatever, able to maintain that number of species diversity in the wild, including coffee arabica. So, like the one which is mentioned now in the Yayu forest, you may go there and see those farmers. They are one of the poorest guys, but they say that we can remain poor, but we give priority to the Yayu forest so that this world or global treasure, coffee arabica, can be sustainably managed.
So just give us a sense of how that works, because they actually they farm within the forest boundaries, don't they?
Yeah, how we do is that, there is a core zone where we live to nature. You go to Yayu Coffee Bioreserve, so the core is left for nature. No one is really touching there, no one is really going there. But there is also a managed zone where farmers will integrate something for their livelihood. And then a little bit away from the core zone is where the farmers, do intensive agriculture. So that way, the farmers try to diversify their livelihood and then produces, but also while, giving a priority to the sustainable management and the protection of those wilderness in the Yayu forest and in many places like that.
But Adifiras, let me be clear, this is a long-standing tradition in Ethiopia, isn't it?
Yes.
So this is something that people have done for years. And so the question, I suppose, is, in places where we don't have this tradition of kind of, wild lands being combined with agriculture, how can we roll out that kind of style of agriculture elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, I think there are many efforts now encouraging, agroforestry, as we mentioned in the case of forestry, climate-smart agriculture, resilient agriculture, the agroecology. There are many practices now that have been promoted, recognizing the fact that we have so many problems with the way we grow, process, and consume food. We have so many problems that the system actually is really failing to feed and nourish people. We still have around 800 million people who go hungry every day. And agriculture is the sector the most vulnerable to climate change and also the one that contributes most to greenhouse gas emissions. The third of global greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. So we're looking for these nature-based solutions, going back to basics and really promoting the practices that promote soil health, water quality, and also biodiversity. And this goes to the importance of actually working with farmers and raising awareness of these practices, really putting farmers at the center, giving them incentives to promote these practices and not just to focus on food production. And I just want to highlight one really important issue here, since we're talking about finance at this COP, and the importance of finance. In agriculture, we have so many contradicting factors. For example, subsidies. We have, around the world, governments spend 500 billion a year on agricultural subsidies. And these are harmful to the environment, harmful to the way we produce food. The whole ecosystem in terms of water quality, soil quality, etc. So we need to repurpose these subsidies, to keep farmers benefiting from them, but put them somewhere where the whole ecosystem can benefit. We can build soil quality, we can improve biodiversity, and we can improve food security as well. So I just want to highlight this point, since we're talking about finance, and there are many other aspects that we need to talk about, and not just to talk about the trillions that we need to mobilize. There is so much efficiency that we need to do.
Sig, you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, but we need options, and this is where the nature's options come back in the vision for adapted crops and soils, and thank you for the investments being made there. The breeders are now thinking about not just breeding for yield, but breeding for the planet. We need options that build soil carbon, and so that is where we hope that investments in the CGIAR and in CIMMYT will include thinking about these breeding, working with the world's biodiversity in Ethiopia, and Kew being one of the conservators of this. That's how we can make sure that there's new options for the future, is making those research investments. So Nature Positive is also looking forward, future-proofing, not just looking at the historical varieties. Thank you.
So Caspar, let's bring you back in and talk about how, Kew and its incredible store of seeds and wild varieties can help with all of this. What kind of innovations can you bring to this?
So my work largely focuses on legume crops, particularly beans, common bean, soybean, which obviously have major impacts across the world, both negative and positive. They're a key source of protein for our own diets, but also for animal husbandry. Now, if you look at the food system as a whole, those beans are crucial for soil health, crucial for reducing those greenhouse gas emissions, because they've got this symbiosis, this partnership with soil bacteria called rhizobia. So they produce nodules in the roots, again, root-based existence for these bacteria, and they capture that nitrogen that most other crops on the planet need to get from fertilizer. And that fertilizer, most of the time, comes from fossil fuels. So the big issue here is really implementing those changes to our food systems from every scale, from smallholder agriculture all the way to very large-scale monoculture, ensuring we go back to those rotation systems that we had previously across the world, bringing legumes, beans, pulses, you name it, back into that system to get that soil carbon up.
But it's quite difficult for farmers. I was at a farm in Lincolnshire like 2 weeks ago, and they were doing regenerative agriculture, and they were doing co-cropping with legumes and other crops in order to benefit from exactly what you're saying, the kind of natural processes that bring nitrogen to the soil. But they were saying the yield is a bit lower, and there isn't actually any reward, because when you take it to market, it's the same product as somebody who's bred it intensively. And you may be restoring soil carbon, but there isn't actually a kind of market for that. So farmers who want to do the right thing do feel as if there is a bit of a financial penalty for them.
Unfortunately, when we go to a soil that is impoverished, it will take a few years to get back to the same yields that you would expect by pumping in artificial synthetic fertilizers. And those few years are where we need to go back to those subsidies protecting farmer livelihoods until they can reach those targets that are self-sustaining and improving.
Are you saying Mary needs to find a way of pricing soil carbon?
In a sense.
there are schemes in the UK to encourage people to do it. Can we just see, can we pick up, sorry, I'm obsessed with the soil carbon. I've spoken to Sieg at the beginning. I'm obsessed with the soil carbon because it's really dramatic, the difference it makes if you do things like plough. So the idea of regenerative agriculture is not to break the surface of the soil and to drill the seeds in. Give us an idea of how much difference that makes in terms of storing soil carbon.
Well, I just want to point out that indeed that legumes are part of storing carbon too, because we do need to reduce, there's only so much fossil fuel derived fertilizers, and we need more but then there's different solutions in different places. In Africa we need more nitrogen, but in other places we need to throttle back, right? But in both cases, we need legumes to make that happen. But yeah, soil regenerative practices can really make the difference for the co-benefits we've heard about we need, both the adaptation and the mitigation, because we can often, when you first start farming, you lose like 50% of the soil carbon.
So when you turn the soil...
you turn the soil, it releases the carbon. But that is an opportunity. That's a huge deficit that we can now fill up. And
so I don't understand that.
Okay, so as you do more regenerative practices, that can all be filled with carbon. It's a sink.
Yeah,
so it can become a net negative effect.
But you're saying don't turn it at all, and
don't turn it and use diversity, and you will rebuild it until then you have that whole soil filled with organic carbon, and then it'll hold water better, it'll hold nutrients better, it'll fertilize. But I just want to bring up this point about that it takes 4 or 5 years. A lot of people said, oh, it's wonderful and everyone should just do it, but we have to get people over that hump. But then actually yields will get better.
Well, this is what these Lincolnshire farmers were saying exactly that. They were in year 3 and they were saying that they hadn't seen a benefit yet, but obviously understood the process and were saying they were hoping to see it. Exactly. So there is a real education needed. Adifiri's, I know you want to, Zituni, you want to speak, but let me bring Adifiri's in here. There is you have to, farmers need to understand why they're doing this stuff, right? And that must be quite a difficult process. Educating people and persuading them this is the right thing to do.
Yes, on one hand, we need to understand that farmers do have a very extensive knowledge on how to manage their landscape. They were there because they have this knowledge of managing their landscape. Go to Borana pastoralists. These were people who managed rearing livestock in that very harsh, environment for millennia. But now climate change came, and then it surpassed their knowledge, and it has broken what they know. So now the impact of climate change has become more than the capacity or the knowledge background of our farmers and our pastoral communities. There is where we need to support the pastoral communities and also smallholder farmers, in building their understanding on how to manage this new pressure from the environmental crisis because of climate change, so that they can cope with. And then the farmers also need resources. Now go to the Yayu forest. Those poor farmers I mentioned to you. They pledged to the global community. Here you find your wild, ancestral coffee in our forest. Not only coffee, but also hundreds of species, tree species, grass species, so on and so forth, bird species, wildlife here. We wanted to sustainably manage it. We wanted to keep it, but we need also to food for our kids. We wanted to send our children. You say that there is a market for carbon, but we don't see it. You say that there is this climate finance. We don't see it. These are some of the requests by the farmers that we need to also understand. My final point on this carbon issue, when we talk about soil and soil carbon, unless and otherwise we cover the soil, unless and otherwise we keep forest in the upper watershed. If a rain comes on a degraded landscape, then it will immediately turn into flood and then erode everything in the farmland, and then you lose. So that is why, for instance, the government of Ethiopia said that I will plant 50 billion seedlings to restore 54 million hectares of degraded land. This 54 million hectares of degraded land was a figure which is given to us by the World Resource Institute, saying that we need to restore. So that we have been doing this Green Legacy initiative, where priority is given first to conserve existing forest, existing wetland, existing critical ecosystem. Second, to plant trees to restore those degraded landscapes. So that way we build the resilience of the landscape, but also the communities. But still there is a lot of gap, financial gap, human gap, technological gap, where the government of Ethiopia, for instance, requires a support from the global community. Your Excellency is a minister here, and I hope that she heard what I know we have been claiming, at least. Thank you very much.
Zituni, did you have something you wanted to add to this?
I want just to go back to the point you were mentioning earlier about how the yields are actually not, big enough for farmers to make profits, and that's absolutely a good point. I mean, farmers have to make a profit; it's their livelihood. But we're not talking about one practice that is going to be applied across the board. I mean, agriculture is complex, complicated, and diverse. Even within the same country, there are different capacities, different types of soils, and different agriculture that can be done here and there. So we have to bear that in mind. And also, we shouldn't forget about smallholder farmers. Most of our food is produced by smallholder farmers, and their needs are different to the big farmers and those who have, a big land. So we have to take that into consideration as well. Just want to make a point on carbon, since we're talking about carbon. And at this COP, we made progress on carbon markets. It's very encouraging. This is going to happen. There is no stopping it. And I think we need to think ahead. We need to think of what kind of agriculture we want for the future. And I think carbon is a great opportunity for farmers, because if it's done properly, it would enable farmers actually to diversify their income. The same as having also renewable energy on farm. I mean, we have to be creative going forward. The world has changed. Many things have changed. We have to change as well, because the system we have at the moment is not fit for purpose. There is no way that we can continue business as usual, because it's very risky. So we have to think creatively and think about new opportunities for farmers and think about sustainability at the heart of all of this.
So do we have the data to price carbon? Do we understand the processes well enough to be able to say, well, the farmers have added this much carbon, and that is a kind of commodity that now they can get some kind of reward for?
I mean, I'm in such an esteemed panel here because they're making all the points I usually make. But this point about fit for purpose, that it's diversity. You can't say we understand perfectly everywhere. But I was very honored to hear that the minister agrees with me that it's, perfection is the enemy of the good, that we actually have on our smartphones a way to imperfectly, but actually reasonably understand soil carbon now. So it's only about 80% of as good as a lab. But can you imagine 1 million farmers measuring soil carbon at 80%?
How does it work?
It's color. It's all color. Remember, a good soil, any farmer will tell you, is dark black. But in the past, the background is different. It's red somewhere. We know soils vary. So if you know where you're standing in the planet, and we do with georeferencing now, then they pull out the background, and then the blackness left is soil organic matter, is carbon. And so we actually have better ways. But the really cool thing is we're starting to see at Summit, we're using this in Ethiopia and Malawi to then empower farmers to make their decision, because they are the master practitioners, right? So instead of telling them,
understand the value of carbon in their
soil. Of course. And so instead of telling them you should use this much fertilizer, you should put your compost here, we're saying this is where your soil is the lowest carbon. Now, master farmers already knew that. They always teach us that. But really, many farmers don't know that, young farmers, and so they can now use their phones to check what is organic. The cool thing is that then it also goes up to the world soil carbon maps. So it's still pieces coming together, and we really do need to do more than pilots. But we are starting to see innovations in extension, which is adult education around soil carbon. And that is what will make the difference, not some new type of technology, in my view. It's people.
These basic technologies done at scale can give us a real understanding of the
We have the technologies. We now need to empower the people. It's people, plants, and soils together.
And on the subject of innovation, Casper, I want to bring you back in, because I teased the idea that we were going to talk about false bananas and crop wild relatives. So you're going to have to explain. Let's start with crop wild relatives.
Sure.
How can they be and play an innovative role in sustaining sustainable agriculture?
So, as some of us discussed earlier, focusing on this common staple breadbasket that we have done for the last 150 years, is not the way forward. And
so these are the 3-5 crops that the world kind of
your
is
corn,
50% of
maize,
calories.
wheat, etc. And instead, we have to look at the vast number of other crops and crop-related plants, edible species, that we can harness.
And Zaytoun, you said there were, what, 30,000 of them? 30,000? Our ancestors ate 30,000. We're 125. Yeah.
Yeah. So the top line numbers vary. At Kew, we've looked into how many edible plant species there are, and we could go higher. But some plants you only eat once. Then we've got this.
What do you mean by that? Right.
Well, everything's edible, right?
Yeah.
but it's case by case, right? So, for example, a crop wild relative from northern Mexico, tepary bean, was also domesticated by indigenous groups there. This is really heat resilient, drought resilient, salt stress tolerant. It's a desert plant. And tepary bean has been used by CIAT in Colombia to add to your common bean, which you get in your tin of beans, just a little bit of that wild relative diversity into the genome, into the DNA.
So this is about plant breeding or about introducing new species into our kind of palette of
you have
crops?
to use all the tools available. Yeah. So you only need a little bit of crop diversity into that kind of stayed gene pool, if you like, that we're reliant on.
So just to make sure, you grow the variety alongside other varieties, or you breed it into the crops that you're already farming.
Again, it's both.
Okay.
So what you want in a diverse system, whether it's diverse on your plate or diverse in the field, is a bit of everything. You can't rely on that corn anymore just as corn by itself.
But consumers are resistant to that kind of change. We don't want to. I mean, it's teff, isn't it, in Ethiopia, that people eat teff, and that has never taken off. So that's another grain that we could be eating worldwide, but has quite limited area that it's eaten.
No, I think it is expanding. Now it is in US, it is in Europe. It's really very much, taken fast, I may say. Yeah, the point is that we need to underline on this one. For instance, despite Ethiopia has more than 128 food species on the far, distributed on agricultural landscape, more than 128. But the majority of them has been going out from the farm because of, the shortening of the growing season particularly. We made a very extensive study in the northern part of the country where the growing period for almost all stable food has shortened, so that for the majority of them, when they are in the flowering stage, then the rain has gone. Then that means that these food crops cannot, continue to make, the seed. And even if they started to set seed, that seed cannot be filled because the soil moisture is already dried. That is a very, very serious challenge you have been facing now. So what we are doing is now we are trying to select the most resistant one, that is selection within the existing one, for instance, from different provenances that we do for crops, for trees, but also the breeding thing. As my brother said, that we need to combine, all those systems. But again, as we do this, there are a lot of challenges. Technology, human knowledge is very much limited institution. They might have, a trained guy who went to a good school in Europe or in America, but as he come back, then, those laboratories are not there. Or they may be, deficient of chemicals, to do those things. So, then now I always say that, okay, Kew Botanical Garden, this is, a global heritage where we keep some of at least, our germplasm there. But while we do that, but we also need to support those, in situ conservation, where we can keep species at the habitat, but that need, financial support, technological support, and that I want to come back again and again to this climate finance. And yeah, thank you.
Casper, let me just, having promised false bananas
Sure.
at the top.
Well, this is a good point to come in.
Yeah, exactly.
Because colleagues at Kew are working with Ethiopian collaborators on NSET, on this false banana.
What is NSET? Why is it so important?
So you see that in that photo there, some of you can. NSET is a relative to banana, but you don't eat its fruit. You eat the starch from its very large stem. It's a huge tree, if you like. And people for many hundreds, if not thousands of years in Ethiopia have been using it as a crop in their small-scale farmer systems to really live off in those hard times, because you can have this plant growing there in your back garden, in your field, and it's there when it's needed, and it's really resilient.
And it produces a huge amount of calories, doesn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
No, I just quickly want to, I want to go to Adipheres, because there has been an issue with NSET in Ethiopia, hasn't there? That the area covered with NSET has fallen really quite dramatically in recent years. Is that a climate impact, or is that... Wasn't there a disease that attacked it?
Yeah, that is a disease. You know, this, we call it, NSET is a famine food, honestly speaking. This is a species, you know, like previously it used to be considered as, you know, a poor man food. But later on, you know, the scientists came in and then this is a very, you know, very quality food which has a lot of fiber in it and also tolerant to disease, to drought and so on. Now we started to expand this species out of its previous, you know, habitats actually or ecology. And then now, because, you know, it grows as a monoculture in many parts, and then all of a sudden a disease which I cannot name now has come. And now that started to kill, you know, a number of trees in many parts of the country, where, you know, Ministry of Agriculture has been calling upon, you know, colleagues, research institution to help us identify the type of disease and also the type of treatment. Otherwise, if we are going to lose this species because of that change, which the scientists say that, okay, this new disease never happened before, is a kind of bacteria, might be not triggered because of the changing climate, but also because of changing farming system, because now, you know, we started to expand it as a cluster, you know, as a mono crop, I may say, but now we are saying that, okay, let we integrate as many species as possible in the landscape so that it will we will diversify the homestead or the home garden, so that this agroforestry system or agroforestry practice might help us, you know, to undermine that, you know, spreading disease. But it has been challenged, honestly speaking, despite it is a very, very important species.
Sig, was there something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just want to say that this future-proofing through perennials, this is a crop that grows for many years. We're actually using this now in the CGIAR to inspire us to take rice to grow for multiple years. So it's actually a phenotype that you can bring into other crops. So this idea of vision for adapted crops is not only to take neglected crops, but it's to reform our main crops to have these resilience in them. And perennials is how you build soil carbon too. So I think having more options for farmers is really key. And we can look at historically nature's systems that farmers have developed, but then give more options so that modern crops can also have this diversity of features to grow as perennials, right?
So I'm going to take that opportunity, because we're reaching the end of our time. There's so much more we could talk about. I've got lots of suggested questions here that we haven't even got to, but it's been absolutely fascinating. As we draw it to a close, I would like to ask all the panelists for a concluding thought. Adipheres, I'm going to start with you. Adipheres, what do you think, and take it from an Ethiopian perspective, what does the future of food for Ethiopia look like for you?
It is going to be very much challenged because of climate change. As I said, that for most of stable crops, the growing period is shortening, that is, and drought frequency and also severity is increasing. Land degradation is a challenge, but also because as a nation you cannot lose hope that we started to see also green light, for instance, because of this climate smart irrigation, wheat irrigation agriculture, where Ethiopia is able to produce a lot of wheat, really, honestly speaking, in a very short period of time. That is what we wanted to push, as we also care for water and also for salinity. That is, where the researchers need to support. But also the government has identified agroforestry, this regenerative agriculture, climate smart agriculture in general, as a way to build resilience in our food system, where we wanted to bring, tree-based food like avocados, mangoes, and also those wilder fruit trees to be domesticated, managed, so that our plate will diversify. And I hope that we will strive, with the support of the global community and also our smallholder farmers and pastoral communities.
Dr. Adefere Worku, the chair of the Green Legacy Initiative Technical Committee, thank you very much. So next to you, Casper, what is your future of food?
I see it in diversification. We need to diversify for climate mitigation as well as for climate resilience. Essentially, we need to have everyone on board, from farmers to policymakers, to speed up that process and to ensure, de-risk that process.
Casper Chater of Kew Gardens, thank you very much indeed. So Sieg, what about you?
I really do think it does take everyone at the table. As we've seen, it takes the partnerships of public, private, and civil society working together, because we have a lot of technologies, and agroforestry, agri-food systems are really coming to the fore as part of. It's always been part of the problem, as we heard, 30%, but it's now part of the solution. So I do have confidence, but I think it takes a certain bravery. We need to be bold but not take too much risk in terms of thinking of brand new types of crops built on how nature has worked in the past. Instead of just fine-tuning wheat, we need to be thinking about wheat plus soils, so conservation agriculture plus new types of wheat like perennials. So we have to be a bit bolder, but I do have confidence in youth and in public-private partnerships like we're seeing all around us. Thank you.
Sieg Snap, Program Director of the Sustainable Agri-Food Systems at CIMMYT. Is that all right? Okay, Zituni, come on, your vision for the food future.
The food of the future need to be three things. It has to be sustainable, has to be resilient, and it has to be inclusive, because we have to be able to feed and nourish everyone in the planet. And this brings me to one of the points which is really central to achieving this objective, which is us, the consumers. Are we ready, also, as you said, to be brave, to discover new taste, to really change our mindset, our behavior? We still throw away the third of the food that is produced for human consumption. It doesn't make any sense, while we have 800 million people who are dying of hunger. So I just want to highlight the future of food has to be based on us really also making those efforts in changing our diet towards diet that is really nutritious. So it's not just about feeding people, it's nourishing people, because there are around 3 billion people who can't afford even the cheapest healthy diets. So these aspects have to be included in the future of the food.
Dr. Zituni Uldada, Senior Advisor of the FAIR Initiative, a food adventure for us all in the future. And before we end, can I invite Minister Craig back up here for a few reflections, it says. Yes, come on.
I wasn't expecting to give my reflections,
Sorry
but that's absolutely fine, because I've always got something to say. Well, I just want to say a couple of things. One is that soil is our Cinderella ecosystem, isn't it? But we neglect it at our peril. And I have become a very huge advocate of soil science ever since I did an inquiry into it as chair of the Environmental Audit Select Committee back in 2017, whether it's contaminated soil on which we build our homes in our inner cities, and how we can actually wash the soil to make it safe for people and animals to live on again. It is a very important thing for policymakers. But I think just listening to the different levels of scientific knowledge that we've had this morning on the panel, and the way that Kew is working with institutions around the world to bring this knowledge to people. I remember traveling in South Sudan when it was a new country back in 2012, and hearing there that having access to the weather forecast helped farmers increase their crops by 17%. So things that we think are normal, which is access to knowledge and information, are not normal in certain parts of the world. And I'm excited by what I've heard today around the level of collaboration, the level of innovation, the level of understanding that we have, the brilliant people that we have on our side to help us tackle these challenges as they arise, whether it's pests or a changing climate, and the fact that we have these really precious seed banks around the world within which we have the periodic table of food, the treasure trove of tens of thousands of years of human knowledge and understanding. And I think all we can say today is we really don't know what we don't know, and there's definitely more to find in this area. So thank you all, scientists, for all the work that you've done.
Thank you, Minister Cray. Thank you all for listening.